Okay, good. So I see it's already 4:01, so I'm going to call the April 12th, 2021 Select Board meeting to order. And we're not expecting Susan Bates to be here today, so we need to have a clerk pro tem.
Okay, I'd like to nominate Jane Hotchkiss as our clerk pro tem for today's meeting.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. I will call the roll. Let's see here. Myself, aye. Matt?
Aye.
Terry?
Aye.
Jane?
I guess aye.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. And that's unanimous and the chair so declares. All right. I will also consider that a roll call for who is present.
Sounds good.
Good. Okay, I'll read the consent agenda. The gift acceptance from Michael B. and Mary S. Fox Fund for $2,500 to the Council on Aging gift account with our gratitude. And one-day liquor licenses for the sale of all alcoholic beverages at Concord Country Club located at 246 Old Road to 9 Acre Corner for the following dates. 4/30/2021, 5 to 11:30 p.m. 5/7/2021 at 5 to 11:30 p.m. 5/14/2021 at 12 to 6 p.m. 6/4/2021 at 1 to 5 p.m. 6/5/2021 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. 6/18/2021 12 p.m. to 6 p.m. 7/16 and 7/17/2021 from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. 7/18/2021 at 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. 7/30/2021 at 12 p.m. to 6 p.m. 8/6 and 8/7/2021 from 11 a.m. to 9 p.m. 8/13 and 8/27/2021 from 12 p.m. to 6 p.m. 9/9/2021, 11 to 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. 9/12/2021, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. 9/15/2021, 12 p.m. to 6 p.m. and November 5th, 2021 at 5 to 11:30 p.m.
Move to approve the consent agenda.
Second.
Okay, will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
Ms. Ackerman.
Aye.
Ms. Escobedo.
Aye.
Myself, Jane Hotchkiss, aye.
Unanimous and the chair so declares. The town manager's report.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Just very brief this week. The one thing I did lead off with, unfortunately, I don't have any updates on vaccine. The governor did give an update today saying that they were awaiting some further news from the federal government about implications for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine delays on the Commonwealth supply. So stay tuned for more information on that. Still no word on the regional vaccine clinic that I'm aware of as I sit here right now. One of the issues I wanted to just put on the radar screen is an issue that we call PFAS, PFAS. It's per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, also known more easily as forever chemicals. I think there's the regulatory guidance on PFAS is something that is emerging from the state. The DEP promulgated some regulations in 2020 that create thresholds on these forever chemicals. And so now communities are now testing, including Concord, which tested, I think, a week or so ago. It's hard to talk about this without sounding alarmist, but my intent here is to not sound an alarm. We don't know if we are in a situation where we would have to take action to provide an alternative source of drinking water to vulnerable populations, which would be a possible course of action depending on how we test. So I don't want to, like I said, raise alarms on this, but I also don't want to not share with you this information and the possibility. So if the worst case scenario comes comes to fruition, we're not totally caught off guard. So this is something Alan Cathcart has spent a lot of time working on, and I can tell you that the water, our water superintendent John Rogers and Alan spend hours trying to work with our community partners in addressing this. So we are on top of it. There's just some unknowns, but the town of Wayland is going through a situation now where they are working on trying to provide bottled water for some of their vulnerable populations. So that's something that maybe could happen here. The thing that I want to be clear about, though, is that Concord's water has not changed. It's just the regulatory standards for PFAS has. And so I think, for people at home, I just want to make sure that you're aware that there's not a change in the quality of our water. It's change in how the quality of our water is evaluated by DEP. And so that's just something that's important. So if you've been using the water for a long time and, it hasn't bothered you any, I don't see any reason why you would need to stop that immediately. But it is something that is a new regulatory structure that we are working on. So are there any questions on PFAS specifically?
Stephen, when will the results be known?
I think a week or two. And then you would need a confirmatory test either way. So I think it's going to be in several weeks before we know for sure if we need to take some kind of action. One of the things we're fortunate that even though we are working on the intake at NACOG, surface water sources generally are less susceptible to these than groundwater sources. And so we do have once the intake is done, a reliable source of surface water. And again, I think this is an issue for everybody. And when I mean all towns, communities, it's a nationwide issue. And again, I think it's not something new in the water. It's just a new way of looking at it. And I think that this is something that the state and federal governments are going to have to eventually provide some meaningful assistance to municipalities and counties across the country, because we just won't have the ability to, deal with it as a series of one-offs. But we'll let the board know when we have more information. Jane?
I was just going to suggest, having had the lucky opportunity to have spent more time looking at this than many people have, I would suggest at some point in the next quarter that we try and do a little bit more of an in-depth discussion of that, perhaps have Alan here and really let the community know as much as we know, not just about what our levels are, but where it comes from and why it's being regulated now.
Yeah, we've been talking about that for a few weeks, but we felt like, and under the heading of not wanting to raise alarms, wait till we have some good information to share. But Alan and I have been talking for a while about having a more thorough presentation or discussion here at the board. So that is definitely something that's on our list as we know more. Any more questions about PFAS? So, okay. And then just a few more things from CPW. They are working on their roads program, and there'll be a public meeting with the Public Works Commission, where there'll be a discussion of that. There's also some right-of-way. The right-of-way construction season opened on April 5th. So working like in driveways and things like that in the right-of-way, that work cannot go forward. The paint shed is open again. They're doing a lot of athletic field maintenance right now. And then the last thing I had on my report was just a recitation of a brief summary of a presentation we saw at the Transportation Advisory Committee regarding a wildlife culvert replacement project under Route 2. There's two culvert issues that we're talking about. One is the Powder Mill culvert, which is an art installation project that is a separate discussion that we're having with Mass DOT, because that really is not a construction thing. That's just I don't want to say decoration, because it's really more than that. It's an art installation. The other culvert issue is the wildlife culvert, and that's going to involve some closures on some weekend work and closures of Route 2. Which is, it's kind of a big deal. The detours and the traffic management plan as it exists today is posted in a slideshow form on the Transportation Advisory Committee's page on our website. It's also in the packet. And if folks have the time, they want to go back and watch the discussion from the TAC, where representatives from Mass DOT were present. You can do that as well. Or if you have questions, you can send them in to CPW. But I would just watch for variable message boards and maybe some information on social media about more details as we get close to the project. But it will be disruptive over the weekends because the Rotary will be, there will be detours along with the Rotary. So just please bear that in mind. And that's pretty much all I have.
I just wanted to, for those who might be displeased with some road closures on Route 2, we've had some amazing shots of wildlife with the wildlife cams in some of these passages. So, there's a real upside to all of us in Concord to having these passage points.
Yeah, Jane, actually, I appreciate you bringing that up because I'm, of course, focused on traffic and message boards and police details and, quite honestly, anticipated complaints. But the bigger part of this is once we get through all of that, they do really work well. And as the chief engineer for the project from DOT, mentioned last week, they will have the wildlife cams, and it will be something really kind of neat for the community. So there's a definite positive benefit once we get through the weekend headaches. So I do appreciate that.
Okay. Any other questions for the town manager? Thank you. Okay, I'll move on to some brief remarks. I just want to comment that, every year our Concord residents are asking for enhanced services either from the town or from other private and nonprofit organizations and entities in town. And with that comes inevitable change, often new uses for land use, often expansion or redesign of buildings, and impact on neighborhoods. For the town, at least, we have a committee process and a regulation framework and other public forums where there's an opportunity for new developments and efforts to be vetted, for the public to lend suggestions for improvements to projects, et cetera. We have a number of these conversations right now that are going on in the community, and they are a challenge for our committees to navigate. But I want to commend both our committee members and our citizens for their thoughtful discussions as they engage around some of the issues and projects that are before the town. There are also obviously projects and new developments and also building projects that are related directly to the private sector and nonprofits. And usually those entities also make some effort to engage with the public. And again, that's an important process, both for the improvement of the projects under consideration, but also for an opportunity for the public to make their concerns known. I just want to comment that because we have a number of these conversations going on simultaneously in the community, that it's important that people know that the select board and our committee members are listening to the feedback that they're receiving, number one, and that where we can, we are making recommendations pertinent to the projects that are before us. And that I also want to point out that where the select board can be helpful in facilitating conversations, particularly when we have some major neighborhood concerns, that we are always helpful to do that. On a lighter and brighter note, I want to comment that just because we're not having a Patriots Day parade on Monday does not mean that the spirit of Concord, which is the sort of the program moniker, I guess I would say, that has been propagated by the business district, encouraging all of our citizens and our tourists and others to take advantage of our local businesses, our restaurants, and the many activities that may still go on at a smaller scale level in town. So with that, that concludes my remarks. All right, the first item on the agenda is the Pollinator Health Advisory Committee charge revision that's before us. And I see that Mark Hansen is here. And the select board had in their packet a revision to consider. So are there any suggestions for further revisions to what's before you?
Linda, if I could just give a little bit of background on this.
That would be helpful. Yeah,
Right.
and I would also, I have a couple revisions if no one else does.
Right. And I'm looking for it in the packet, but it's not jumping out as second. However, what I wanted to point out to everybody is that the revisions that came out last week were scrapped in exchange for a much simpler version of an updated Pollinator Health Advisory Committee charge for this year. So you'll see largely the suggestions are about date changes and a more general approach versus a tight 1 year effort.
Thank you for pointing that out, and that's important changes. So I'll ask again of the select board members if they have any suggested further revisions. Terry.
Just, I think, a grammatical thing, the last paragraph in part A. Looks like it got changed from there to them, but I don't think that's grammatically correct. It probably there made more sense in that last sentence in background.
I agree. I think you're right. We'll catch that. Okay. Anyone else on the select board?
Yeah, I just had a question because it just seems like there is in the beginning a discussion about trying to educate the public. But then when I look at the set of tasks, the duties and responsibilities, I don't see anything there other than, a public hearing. I guess that's it. Is that it? It solicits a public opinion, and including holding a public hearing to update residents in the fact-finding process. But, when I look up at the beginning, it says, that it needs to educate citizens, lawn care companies, and farmers about the environmental risks of these compounds and advising on alternative best practices. And I don't see any actions related to that.
I think you're right, and that would be a welcome addition to that section D.
Yeah, because otherwise it just looks like the thing is just to monitor the health and report on how the pollinators are doing.
Yep. So we can probably, we won't wordsmith that right now, but I think a bullet point to that effect that sort of picks up on the language from the introduction and add it to expand on the education role of the committee for the general public would be helpful there.
Okay. Actually, Linda, I just noticed it's called in the title Pollinator Health Advisory Committee, but down in one of the last sections, it's called a study committee. Section E. So I just think we should be consistent.
Yep. Okay. In section B, the fifth line down, I would recommend that we, let's see, it looked like the word two pollinators, let me see, had already been crossed out. Is everyone following where I am? The fifth line down, under section B, under purpose, sorry.
Yeah.
And then the next sentence, it says, the committee will review. And I would cross out and or revise. I would just say the committee will review town policies regarding the use of neonicotinoids on town-owned land and review or propose town policies, if any. I don't think you're changing the meaning as just as much as trying to make that more reasonable there. And then under section G, to fully understand local, state, and federal regulatory roles regarding the use of neonicotinoids, including the Massachusetts Pesticide Board. And again, that's assumed, but I just wanted explicit so that people who are considering joining this committee are also aware of board, if that makes sense. And then under 3, public hearing in Concord has a specific, specific meaning. And I'm wondering if we would be more appropriate to say either public forum or public meeting.
I agree.
I agree. That was part of my confusion.
Yeah, okay. Okay, those are the major changes I saw. And as a 7-member committee, I just want to remind everybody that the quorum is a quorum of 7, even if you do not have full membership.
Well, the quorum would be 4, right?
Correct.
4. The quorum would be 4, right?
Right. Yeah. There still remains a little confusion about that, so that's why I'm just pointing that out right now for, okay. All right. Any other comments from the select board? Okay, I did see, okay. I think we're good there. Okay, Steve, did you want to make a brief comment?
Yes, I think a lot of things have changed over the years with pollinators and the surroundings.
Steve, my fault. Will you please state your name and address?
Oh, I'm sorry. Steve Verrill, 415 Plainfield Road.
Thank you.
And a lot of things have changed over the years as some of the marginal land has been developed. There used to be a lot of goldenrod and loosestrife around, and those are great sources of feed for bees. And through natural resources, we pretty much did away with a loosestrife because it was an invasive, and that was replaced with Phragmites that has no benefit to bees at all. I think those are some of the things we want to think about in terms of what's growing around. And the other thing, the state bee inspector has mentioned that there are way more hives disappearing because they don't get proper care from amateur beekeepers in terms of supplying plenty of feed for the winter and controlling the ticks and other husbandry things. So I just wanted to throw that out as something that might be included in educational projects.
Good. It also sounds like you might be a good candidate for that committee.
Well, I've always been an ag committee member, so.
Okay. All right. I think we've had some, Mark, I'll just give you an opportunity. Did you have anything you wanted to? You're on mute, Mark.
Okay.
Will you please state your name and address, please?
Thank you. Mark Hanson, 340 Holdenwood Road.
Okay.
Yes, Steve's right. There's been a change in the environment that bees face over time, loss of natural habitat. But and of course, neonics, the problem with neonics is they weaken bees and make honeybees more susceptible to disease.
So Mark, excuse me for interrupting you, but I should have been more explicit. Do you have any additional suggestions or revisions for the committee charge itself?
No, I think it's good. I think one thing that we will be doing more of, and I shared this with the committee, is for example, the town of Lincoln is doing very good work with native pollinators, and I think we're going to be doing more work to improve the habitat for native pollinators with homeowners and with institutions.
Okay, so there's nothing in here that prohibits that. Okay, very good. Thank you. Sorry to cut you short, but we're really looking at specific things on the chart so that we can move forward with it. All right, thank you. All right, I think I'm ready to entertain a motion.
Linda?
Yes, sorry.
Before we do that, can we just double check with Steve Verrill and whoever's here from the NRC that, yes, they would like to participate, or that the Ag Committee and the NRC would like to have membership? I assume they do, but just want to confirm.
So, typically the select board identifies those committees that they think are essential to this conversation. And I think we've done that.
Okay.
And we've allowed for a designee in case they don't have available membership. But I appreciate your question.
Oh, actually, yeah, NRC does say designee. Ag Committee doesn't say designee. I'm pretty sure the Ag Committee is okay with it, but just double checking.
No, but that's a good point. We should add or designee there as well, because membership on these committees is tight. Thank you for catching that. Thank you. All right, I'm now ready to entertain a motion.
Move to, hang on, get my motions up here. Where did they go? Sorry, not enough paper. And move to approve the revisions to the Pollinator Health Advisory Committee as included in the meeting materials dated 12/2021 and as amended in discussion tonight.
Thank you, Jane. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, will the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Escobedo.
Aye.
Ms. Ackerman.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
Myself, Jane Hotchkiss. Aye.
Okay, that's unanimous and the chair so declares. Thank you, everyone. And Mark and Steve, you'll have plenty of time for conversation on this one going forward. Sorry to ask for your brief comments today. Thank you. Okay, the next item on our agenda is the long-awaited NMI StarMet Reuse Planning Committee final report. We are excited to have this presentation before us today. And who is going to be introducing this?
Hi, Paul Boehm, 11 Ridgewood Road. Gary Kleiman and I will be tag teaming the presentation.
Well, welcome both.
I will start by sharing my screen. Okay. Move this. Hopefully you all can see this.
Yep.
We can.
Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. So we're pleased to be here on behalf of the entire committee. Gary Kleiman and I are, as co-chairs, are really pleased to present this briefing on our report. The report, which should now be in your virtual hands, if not in your physical hands, and is posted on the website. The committee members listed here have worked really hard and worked as a great team in developing this report and the recommendations to the select board that we'll talk about later. But I'd also like to thank very much our liaisons listed here, Marcia and Matt, who've been tremendously supportive and actively helpful in all the work. I also want to thank the many Concord citizens for their interest and input. along the way through workshops and surveys and comment periods. And also, last but not least, the numerous town committees who've opened their meetings to us, to our members, for exchanges of information and additional ideas. So it's been sort of a robust period of interactions with a number of people in town, and we appreciate it. So the agenda for this briefing really covers the major areas of both the committee's work and progress, as well as of course, the content of the report. The main purpose today is for us to focus your attention, even for a little while, in the exceptionally busy workload that you guys have, so we can keep the momentum going on what we call the reimagining of the NMI StarMet site and the potential uses of the 46-acre site. And in addition, importantly, to give you, the select board, a forum for asking questions at this point in this reimagining process. The report that's in your hands is not a short report, has a lot of details, and so we wanted to entertain questions here. So we're going to leave a lot of time for that. So briefly, we're going to cover the status of the site, the major elements and takeaways of our findings as presented in the report, highlight some of the key issues that were covered, not to go into detail, but just highlight what we've covered, and importantly, to present our recommendations to the select board as to what may come next. So I first want to introduce you to the site. And this is a very recent drone photograph of the site. And I do want to thank Erin Stevens for arranging for the aerial viewing and for the drone pilot, Mark Pauly for actually piloting over the site on a nice day. I think this is a very interesting photo. You're sort of looking west here. What you see here is Main Street is off the photo to the right. To the left is the Powder Mill Woods Trail system. And Thoreau Hills residence on the left. Off the top is the Forest Ridge area, which includes Minuteman Arc, Thoreau Club, and other residences. And off to the upper right corner, if you can squint and imagine, is Valley Sports and the Assabet River. So one theme that we're going to return to here is the potential of this site, not only for reuse and development, but also for conservation of the natural resources and the natural resource use and public enjoyment embodied in the two halves of this photo. The upper half, the development area, which also includes some wooded areas, and the bottom half. This lower half is the much prized and unique sphagnum bog, which if you know a bit about sphagnum bogs, they are very old geological and ecological features, 1,000 years old. There are a couple of them in Concord. And one of our most famous citizens, Henry David Thoreau, actually wrote of a bog, which is out near Ripley School, the other major bog in town. So the town is blessed to be bookended by two sphagnum bogs. So we'll return to this area in a moment in the lower part of the photograph as Gary describes some of the ideas. Just very briefly, I want to very quickly give you information on the evolution of the site. And you've heard most of this, so I'm going to go quickly. It's a site that was purchased by StarMet in 1957, and through 2001, went through different industrial purposes. Cleanup occurred at the site as early as the 1980s, the state cleanup, but it was placed on the National Superfund program list in 2001. So presently, EPA oversees the efforts of the potentially responsible party group to investigate and clean up the site. And interestingly, the settling parties are 98% of the costs of this site will be borne by the federal agencies, the Department of the Army and the Department of the Energy, who contracted for work at the site. Two of the settling defendants, private parties, are Textron and Whitaker, but they have a relatively small percentage of the site. And that's important as we go forward and think about, who's going to pay for this site and clean up and how the payments are going to occur. I mentioned that several cleanup actions have already been completed. I do want to emphasize that over half of the site was never contaminated, which includes 90+% of that bog area and a lot of the wooded area around the site. So the potential for redevelopment includes areas that were never contaminated. The town, through public meetings and through the 2229 Main Street Oversight Committee that Pam Rockwell chairs, had provided a lot of input for the record of decision that EPA put forward to how the site was going to get cleaned up. And then a legally binding document called the consent decree was assigned by the Department of Justice. It was entered into the court, and that commits the parties, legally binds them to clean up the site. And that started early this year on the final stretch of the cleanup, which is going to be about a 5 to 7 year process for cleanup. So at the end of the day, the total cost of cleanup of this site, because it's going to be cleaned up to what they call residential standards, is estimated to be north of $200 million. Almost $250 million will have been spent at the site to get into good shape for reuse and redevelopment and conservation. Briefly, this timeline highlights the committee's activities since its inception in 2019, when the select board created the committee and charged us. The committee work essentially ends with this report, and then perhaps morphs into follow-on efforts that we'll perhaps be discussing a little later. So we began about 2 years ago, but our work really began in September of 2019 with EPA's help. EPA, and by the way, as an aside, EPA is very anxious to see the site redeveloped. They have a whole Superfund redevelopment initiative. They put a contractor at their cost at our disposal, our committee's disposal, to help us with the initial planning. EPA has reached out to the committee and wants to reach out to the select board to help them navigate the process from here to what the eventual redevelopment will be. So they're very anxious to help. So that began in 2019 by collecting information through a public forum, a 2-day public forum where people came in, sat around tables, offered a number of ideas. It was a great brainstorming session. And we've collected all that information, and that appears as one of the annexes of several in the report. But this collecting of information continued to occur throughout, through public input, through meetings with town committees. We met with the select board in February of last year. We developed preliminary scenarios. We had a survey that was out on the website. We collected information, public information from that survey. We continued to prepare the report. That draft report was out on the website. We got public comments on the website. So it's been a very robust interaction of the public with the committee, much to the benefit of the report that has has stemmed from all that information. Just a couple of things on overall on the plans, and Gary's going to go into more detail. We established 4 reuse principles at the beginning, which mirror the town's principles for the long-term growth plans and the long-range planning. And those principles are that the site should have multiple integrated uses. It could be that there's one use, but the idea would be to have multiple integrated uses for the benefit of different stakeholders in the community. Environmental stewardship, that to the extent that development can be sustainable, to the extent that conservation can be maintained and development be carbon neutral, improving landscape resilience, that's embedded as a principle. Fiscal sustainability, to find creative ways to fund the reuse, creative ways to generate revenues from any redevelopment. And finally, community synergy, to strengthen relations not only within the community and within stakeholders within the community, but potentially with adjoining communities as well. So we took these principles to heart as we started our work. Just briefly, at the beginning, one of the first things that we did with EPA's help and with the contractor's help, and the contractor involved in the cleanup knows the site better than almost anybody except Pam's committee. So working with us early on, they helped us to develop these recommended redevelopment zones that are shown on the slide. And they're based on the physical topography of the site, based on the cleanup history of the site. And this 46-acre NMI site potentially could offer up to about 23 acres of development land across these areas, A1, A2, A3, and A4. that you see here, different types of development in those different areas. There will be certain limitations that are established as part of the site's remedy. There'll be a couple of areas like the B area and the D area that will not be able to put structures on. And that will be well known to any developer and to the future owner of the site, which hopefully will be the town. But most of the site will be available for possible development and conservation. So Gary's going to describe more of that in a minute as part of the master plan that we developed for the site. But I just wanted to finish this segment by by showing you through the public input a wide variety of ideas arose, everything from conservation to development, and you can see them all here, just a wide variety of ideas. These categories were initially developed devoid of any context or any due diligence. They were just brainstorming to garner the ideas of the town. And this list here has been refined based on committee deliberations and community input into the range of options that Gary will now present to you. Gary, I'll turn it over to you and tell me when to
Thanks.
flip the slide.
Yeah, you can go ahead and go to the next slide, which it introduces the master plan. So I'm Gary Kleiman, the other co-chair, 57 Central Street, other co-chair of the Reuse Planning Committee. And so Paul did a great job of walking you through sort of the history and context for our committee work. And so now I want to just walk you through very quickly, very briefly, what we came up with as a committee. So the master plan, based upon the site history that Paul shared with you, based upon the topography and physical geography of the site, and based upon the town input, town needs, town preferences, we have come up with what I would call, sort of the top line committee product, which is a recommendation for how this site might be redeveloped or, reused in the future. And has several components, and it does build on what we just discussed. So the area A1 is the area in terms of physical geography, that is the footprint of where the prior factory was, where there's already a flat, foundational area. During the cleanup process, that will be excavated and refilled, but there's already a well-established area for potential redevelopment. So the focus of redevelopment is likely to be in that same space, that A1 space. We can see that being encapsulated by a ring road that would enable circulation around the site, but areas A2, A3, A4 would be potential redevelopment areas in the future, not necessarily identifying specific uses for any of those at this time. So again, the wide range of uses you saw before could all be accommodated within A2, A3, A4, from natural vegetation and conservation areas to other types of development like housing or commercial activities or recreational and sports fields. So there's still a lot of opportunity to consider what kinds of uses could be in any of these areas, but the master plan stops at saying, let's focus on A1 first, have A2, A3, A4 available for other potential development, and really think about area C, the right half of your screen as you're looking at this, reserved for resource conservation, natural resource conservation area, given that it has these unique habitats. The sphagnum bog already has some access to trails and so forth. It really makes sense to preserve that half of the site, which was undisturbed, largely undisturbed by the prior development as natural area. Areas B and D we can discuss, but there are some restrictions on B. We're recommending that it basically just be revegetated after the cleanup is completed there. And area D is a wetlands, would have to remain a wetlands, but it actually would be also restored in a way to service drainage, natural drainage features from the site and accommodate drainage from any development that does happen in area A1. Paul, if you want to go to the next slide, I want to focus more on an additional reason why Area C would make for a nice resource conservation area, habitat protection area, with potentially a bird watching platform or a nature viewing area. Because if you notice, the town in recent years has been collecting parcels of land just off-site as Black Birch was developed, as the Thoreau Club was developed. The town has put together a very nice collection of parcels which have a budding trail network on them already. And this site would enable us to tie in to the already existing trail network and those other natural areas to really round out and create a larger natural trail network and naturally preserved area. So that's part of the reason why we see that Area C as being in a unique position to complement the existing trails. But also some trails around to the other side. So that's kind of as far as we got in terms of what I would say is a definitive recommendation for the select board to consider. We do think that that kind of level of planning makes sense. A master plan of that sort makes sense. But we want to share with you some illustrative options that sort of speak to what we heard from the town, what could be considered, but these are by no means definitive recommendations, the committee is saying, more illustrative opportunities that the town could pursue. But before we decide between option 1, option 2, and option 3 that I'll share with you today, I think an additional planning process is warranted, more due diligence is warranted. We'll get to that in the recommendations. But we do think that these 3 options kind of bookend the possibilities that make sense for Concord, given the needs we have and the opportunities that we see. So option 1 is much more of a municipal community recreational focus. This particular illustration is sort of looking at, up to 6,000 square feet of indoor space that could accommodate things like indoor walking track or basketball courts or meeting space for town meeting or specific programming for senior activities. On the left, you'll see one specific illustration of this coming from a similar community center that was developed in East Boulder, Colorado, where they've done this. Has been a huge hit in the community. So we see an opportunity for something like that. But again, this is one bookend where municipal uses, and here's an illustration of that kind of a new multi-use center, but something that is weighing heavily towards the municipal use side probably would require significant cross-subsidization. Whereas if you go to the next slide, Paul, if you go forward, option 2 sort of takes you the other direction, more private or commercial or office space development. Again, we're focusing within the A1 area because we think that's where it makes sense to focus initial development efforts. There is a potential for building out areas A2 or maybe A4 or some combination in the future with some housing or other types of development. But by establishing a large commercial or office type footprint, you really have an opportunity to generate some revenue, a sort of a pay for the development that would take place there. Again, in all of these options, we're keeping Area C natural. So one variation on the theme, if you didn't want to do just sort of your more typical office park or commercial office space in A1, one opportunity would be, something like a high-tech incubator space, or this illustration is a cloud computing center that could be coupled with an environmental institute or conference facility. So again, these are just illustrations. Why don't you go to the next slide, just to sort of seed thoughts for the select board and for the public, what could be on this site, maybe a new office park. And then finally, those are the 2 bookends, sort of in the middle. I wouldn't say splitting the baby, but, something that brings a lot of different uses together would be a mixed use development that maybe has some commercial space on the first floor for, maybe dining or recreational opportunities, but also has perhaps upper stories that could be populated with apartments or housing opportunities. So by having that mixed use opportunity, you have some revenue generation, you have some opportunity for municipal space, but you also have some commercial and retail tax base that might help to subsidize, say, some of the affordable units in the housing development or similar. And area A3 in this illustration could be used for some of the infrastructure, like leaching fields and things like that, or sewage treatment that could then be covered with, say, a soccer field. And again, a variation on the theme. Tiny houses are all the rage right now. Maybe you could have a tiny house village in one area of A1 and have some, shops and restaurants in another area of A1. So that's, sort of a different concept. But we feel like these three options really kind of encapsulate, where we could go. They're really just teasers. As I say, at this point, the only thing the committee is recommending is the master plan. We do think that it makes sense that there is an opportunity to use this parcel. We do think that and we'll come to it in the recommendations, but the town might be thinking towards moving forward with, taking ownership of this property and redeveloping it at this point, insofar as the master plan conveys, but there's a lot of opportunities beyond that.
Okay, I'll take it back for one slide. The report also has a lot of detail on what we call the key implementation issues, and there are annexes or appendices to kind of follow up on these. But just very briefly, these are the topics that we think are really important for the select board to focus on. First one is risk communication. So, Superfund sites by their very nature and name, they engender concern and often misperceptions and fear. That even though this site is being cleaned up to residential standards and being monitored very closely, the concerns are real. And the reuses of the site and the acceptance by the town residents will rest on a full knowledge of the science, full knowledge of the data, full knowledge of the risks. So a risk communication effort is going to be really important. Related to that, another type of risk is the town's liability. We spent a lot of time and research on this topic. This is the area where the question is, well, what liability, if anything, would the town incur if they own the site, if they purchase the site? We've done a lot of research on the financial liens on the site, and those are known. They have to be confirmed by town council. But EPA and the contractor has given us a list of those financial liens. On the other part of this is information that on liability. EPA has a very special program to limit the liability of municipalities taking over and owning the site, forgiving of any liability that any past liability. So to take over and purchase these sites free and clear. As far as future discoveries, that's also covered in the consent decree, that anything future that's discovered, such as PFAS, which is actually being investigated at the site now very proactively by the parties, would be covered. So there's a lot of information on liability protection. There's a lot of interest in town on housing on the site, various types of housing. So we have a section discussing the various types of housing and housing options that are very possible given the cleanup standards at the site. Gary talked about recreational opportunities. We have a separate section on that and how those opportunities may blend into the Recreation Department's strategic plan. There are several different options for town ownership, outright ownership, partnerships, et cetera, and we have a section covering that as well. This is a very important section in terms of the town's ownership. And I have to say that by owning the site, by acquiring the site, the town is in the driver's seat on the development. Not that it wouldn't be in the driver's seat in terms of zoning, but directing what would happen at the site and how to, and generating revenues from the site and having the town's public enjoy the site that comes with ownership. There's a section on some financial considerations, initial considerations. In that on that topic, of course, those are that's a starting ground for future considerations on capital expenditures, et cetera. Very importantly, coordination with other planning efforts. There's a lot of activity, as you know, going on in town with Concord Middle School, the retirement of the Peabody School, Harvey Wheeler, lots of moving parts in town. And this is just one part of it. So it's doubtful whether planning of this site can occur without coordination with other parts in town. And lastly, as an appendix, we have multiple examples of Superfund redevelopment where municipalities have taken ownership and have redeveloped sites for various purposes for the benefit of the public. So that is a short-winded summary of those implementation issues, which are covered in detail in the report. Back to Gary.
Thanks. And I'll take it back to just finish up with 2 more slides laying out our recommendations for the select board. And then all of those issues that Paul just went through quickly, we're happy to take detailed questions on them. We have more detail that we can share with you, but we want to get to your questions first. So 2 slides on recommendations, near-term recommendations and long-term recommendations. In the near term, we do think, and we are recommending as a committee, that the town begin to develop a process and a path for taking ownership of the site. That requires some due diligence, basically engaging town council, confirm what we suspect about the liability protections that are afforded by the Superfund Acts, confirm what we think we know about the liens on the property and how those can be quickly resolved if the town does assertively move towards taking ownership. But engaging with EPA on for assistance with these things, because EPA has done this a lot of times with other Superfund sites. They have a lot of experience. I think they can guide you effectively, and town council. So what we have learned during our fact-finding exercise suggests this won't be as difficult as it seems, but the town needs to begin working towards it. The other near-term recommendation is we need to decide on a mechanism for further planning. We think your charge was great. It afforded us the opportunity to dive into all of these issues, to provide you with information. But here we are now passing the buck back to you, essentially. And I think you need to make a decision. How do we go forward? Do you want to recharge another subsequent committee like ours? Given that this involves an overlap of issues with NRC, with recreation, with the finance committee, with the planning board, it might make more sense for you to work with those various committees directly. So we want to leave that to you, for you to think about what is the best way to, and we have some options that we laid out in the report. You know, maybe you have one select board liaison working with those committees more directly with quarterly meetings or something, but that's the second recommendation. And then finally, Paul mentioned risk communication. One of the reasons we stopped at the master plan and did not make recommendations about housing or no housing, mixed use versus commercial development, cloud computing center versus tiny house village, is because the public really wants to weigh in more. They have strong opinions about this. Some of their opinions may be misinformed at this point. And we really think before we start making specific recommendations or specific choices on what the eventual uses should be, we need to level set the entire community on what is the risk at the site now, what will it be after cleanup, and what are the safe and potential uses that make sense for the town, given this unique opportunity and the fact that it will be cleaned up to a residential standard in the very near term, 3 years or so. So those are the near-term recommendations. Longer term, we do think that the select board probably, or the planning follow-on planning entity that deals with this, should start gauging demand from some of the third parties for various options, to understand which of the options, or maybe one of the bookends, or maybe one of the middle choices might make most sense. If there's no demand for, a long-term ground lease for the site to develop a certain type of use, it wouldn't make sense to pursue that. Undertaking planning processes to align the StarMed opportunity with other town priorities, projects, and investment needs, that's longer term. But, as you redevelop the middle school, as you redevelop, recreation strategies and so forth, you may want to be thinking about how the StarMet site can play into the town's longer term plans. And then the last is a fiscal impact study. You really need to understand the economics of site redevelopment and how the different options, it would be great to say, let's go with option one, all these great, wonderful municipal uses, but we have to understand how to pay for something like that. If it's more realistic for the town, given the fiscal impact, to focus more on, a commercial office space that maybe, all the town can afford. Maybe there's somewhere in the middle that makes more sense. If you go to the next slide, it's just a graphic again of the master plan, but that's all we had in terms of prepared remarks. And then I think what Paul and I were hoping is that we could answer select board questions for a bit.
So I've taken it off share. We have slides to answer questions if they come up, but I figured we ought to look at each other and not look at a PowerPoint presentation.
Well, thank you both for this presentation and for all the work that you have done personally, each of you, as well as your committee members, to get us to this point. And I would be amiss if I didn't point out, as you mentioned earlier, Paul, I think all the pre-work and continuing work that's been done by the 2229 committee and obviously by Marcia Rasmussen and her department and everyone else that you've worked with on this. I think it's I know, feel proud about this, and we are pleased that you reached out to so many committees in town who could inform your work to date, and that's been, I think, significant and in keeping with what we had hoped to accomplish with the Envision Concord long-range plan. This is coming, and I'm just one other comment before I open it up for the select board questions. As you are acutely aware, this is coming at a time when we are waiting to hear the final recommendations from the Capital Planning Committee, which obviously will inform part of the process here. And we clearly, you've aptly pointed out all the legal and financial considerations that, as well as the risk management that probably needs to occur up front. Some of that we can probably get some financial assistance from grants to perhaps help us do some further work on this. But in other cases, it's probably going to require significant upfront dollars from the town, even to do the further next step in terms of due diligence. So there, as you are well aware after all this good work you've done, there are so many pieces to this that we're going to have to find a framework to pull together to take the next steps. So with that, so thank you for all that you've done to get us to this point. And certainly, we aren't going to be able to answer the question today about the continuation for the immediate continuation in terms of the role for the committee, but there is no question that we don't want to lose the expertise and the engagement and all the work that you've already done.
I just, if I can enter, Linda, I just want to mention one other thing. EPA has, in Boston, has offered many times to kind of sit down and to help guide you through this process.
Yes.
So not starting from scratch, to provide information, but also point you in the right direction, you or town council. So yes, it is complex, but to reduce the complexity of that next step, I think there's a lot of help to do that.
I think you're right. Thank you. So comments or questions from select board members? Terry.
Okay, thank you, Linda. And thank you, Paul and Gary, for the tremendous amount of work. I read the whole report, and it's so well organized and clearly written and so thorough. Thank you. And the site has so much potential. It's really exciting. I went on the site walk, and I was really struck by the beauty of that Area C. And also thank you, on the other hand, we have to have that balance. We have to have that due diligence. So I have a lot of questions, well, several questions about that part of it. The first question is, I saw the phrase in the report a couple of times, the select board should commission the risk communication efforts. And I find this phrase a little bit confusing. Maybe you can explain, what do you mean by commission? You think we need to get a consultant? Do you need, I don't understand what you have in mind with this.
You know, and I don't know, Paul, if you want to handle it, but I would say from my perspective, it's really, you need to think about this in terms of a public relations campaign. I mean, I think that there, as the report points out, there are a lot of misconceptions about the level of contamination or the type of contamination that occurred in the past and what will be the residual risk, if any, after the site is cleaned up. And so I think you probably do need some professional expertise on risk communication, helping the public to understand what level of risk would remain after the site is cleaned up to a residential standard. You know, is it the same as getting a sunburn? Is it the same as your risk of a car accident? Those are the kinds of things that I'm not an expert in, but I think I do know that the town has experts in this field living within the town. You know, Harvard Center for Risk Communication, he came to some of our committee meetings, and I think he would be able to, you know, help the town, but I certainly think he could point us in the direction of what would be an appropriate response for the town to level set understanding on the risks and the misconceptions that have been there.
Yeah, and Terry, there are a number of people on this committee, on Pam's committee, and elsewhere in town who could probably help the select board in as initial step in writing a scope of work, and then to decide how to go about doing it. So commission is a probably too formal a word. It's sort of give somebody the go ahead. Would that require an outside consultant? Potentially. We haven't thought it through that, but I think it does. We need a plan to plan. We need a plan to do that. Okay,
right. We definitely need to communicate risk communication, no question about it. So another question is, I see in a few places that you're talking about possibly the town taking ownership in possibly 2023 or 2024, that's a guess. And you're talking about this occurring after partial cleanup. And I'm wondering why you're saying that and not waiting until full cleanup.
Well, I can. I think EPA and the site contractors are anxious to know who's going to take care of the site after it's cleaned up. I think that timing 2023, 24 is the earliest. You could wait, but I think in terms of some of the planning efforts and some of the things Gary talked about, engaging third parties to start that planning, it may not come to fruition until 3 years after that. We thought that the town needs to be in the driver's seat at some point. You can't wait to the end because that would just start the process.
But I also think that you'll understand more clearly once you engage town council and start reviewing the due diligence for how the process takes place and talk to EPA, because it turns out that there are reasons why the town would want to be owners before the cleanup is completed, because in order to complete the cleanup of a Superfund site, you have to have an owner that is willing to sign off and say, we will maintain institutional controls that are in place at the site. For example, they will leave the site after it's clean with, filtration systems and so forth that need to be maintained. So they don't want to say the site is clean until somebody has signed off and said, yes, we will maintain these systems.
And that's a great segue to my other question, which is, what happens when you're building the infrastructure if something is disturbed and something from the contaminated areas migrates into area A, or worst case, that somebody gets into the stormwater area or another prohibited area? and there's a disturbance, that, because it seems like you covered really well the past liability, the current liability, and the future liability, except for if something is disturbed like this. Or if the town is supposed to maintain it and we don't maintain it properly. Then,
So let me did a little research on this. So let me just go back to something Gary said. As far as, let's say, the pumping systems, the site, all the cleanup is going to be operated and maintained by the cleanup contractor. There's no financial obligations for you to operate a pumping system. There would be obligations if there's a stipulation that says don't dig here, you can't build here. Then the town has to make sure that nobody digs there or builds there, and those are knowns. Now, if you're asking what are the unknowns out there, Superfund liability says that for any contamination caused by the party, an existing contamination that's not discovered in the investigation process, that's past liability. The town is only responsible if you contaminate, or if you break an institute, if you dig where you're not supposed to dig.
Well, that's my question. What happens if the town owns it and one of our contractors is creating infrastructure, makes a mistake, and they dig where they're not supposed to dig? What happens then?
Well, I don't want to talk about insurance policies, but you know, if a developer has a footprint where to dig and doesn't dig there, well, that's like any kind of building, any kind of liability for a contractor. But what I'm saying is the town is only liable for any future contamination that the town causes. If you put in a building and there's a tank in that building, a fuel tank, and that tank spills. But if, let's say there's some other forever chemical, Stephen talked about PFAS. Let's say there's double XYZ that 3 years from now, the state of Massachusetts says is contaminant. If that is in the site already, that is past liability, even if it's newly discovered. The town is only responsible for liability with the stipulations, digging where you're not supposed to dig or contaminating the site. And these are things that are worked out in the Superfund liability details in the consent decree. So a lot of details behind what I'm talking about. But you know, there has to be due diligence in any kind of building.
Right.
Absolutely.
Okay, so another question I have is maybe for the town manager or maybe for Stephen and you folks. But what do you guys see as the process for confirming with all these things with town council? In particular, we need to confirm that we have, you know, that we are minimizing future liability. We need to define what that is. I would like it to be, you know, you can never get to zero liability, but ideally it would be only the same amount of liability as any other property because it's cleaned up to a residential standard. So anyway, my question is what is the process now for engaging with town council to confirm everything?
So I've talked to town council about this in the past, and I know that I think he prepared a memo a few years ago before my time, kind of outlining his view of the things that will need to be analyzed, you know, worked out, the protections that the town would want. We just haven't gotten to the place where we're having that conversation in a detailed way. I think, Paul, you just said 23 or 24 would be when we'd start to really kind of nail that down. So I think, Terry, I think that's I suppose it's not too soon to start, but there's I guess the way I look at this, like most brownfields development, there's not a wide range of issues that need to be sorted out. There's just a significant depth to the issues that need to be really identified. And that usually is pretty site specific. I guess the only thing I was going to say, ask Paul and Gary. Sorry, I'm sorry, Terry. I was going to go on to a related but different thread if you were finished.
Well, it sounds like Paul and Gary are saying we need to work with town council before 2023, like get started now, unless I'm misunderstanding, so that because it's going to help us communicate risk to the public if we can confirm the committee's understanding about the liability.
Yeah, Terry, I think if, by engaging the town council earlier, we confirmed some of the things that Gary and I and others have found, but we're not attorneys and we're not Superfund lawyers. I think we need to confirm all that to lower the anxiety, some of the anxiety that's in your voice, some of the anxiety that we feel about a Superfund site. And just, Stephen, I want to just correct something you said, because this is not a brownfield site. This is a Superfund site. Yeah. And Superfund, there are additional protections. For example, the town acting as sovereign, if you acquire the site for back taxes, assuming you can negotiate all the other liens, which is possible, their back taxes owed. You can acquire the site for back taxes, and you immediately that absolves the town of any liability. Acting as a sovereign for back taxes, that's one of the stipulations that EPA has put out there to attract towns. But Terry, I think getting the town council up to speed so you can make a decision. It's going to take some time to do this, and there are a lot of details.
Exactly. I was just going to agree. I don't think it's so much for helping with the public communication. I just think it would help for the select board to hear from their council that, yes, everything Paul and Gary are saying is actually on the mark, that there are these liability protections from Superfund law that absolves the town of liability for past contamination.
Question, Jane.
First of all, thank you, Paul and Gary and committee and, all of the folks who've been working on this. I, like Terry, went on a tour. It was incredibly eye-opening. And it, for my history in Concord, that's been a mysterious space. And it is much less so now. In fact, it's much more, I had no idea we had a sphagnum bog there. The wildlife option, the wildlife there is quite interesting. And to have such a huge parcel of land potentially usable in our town boundaries is sort of a, I don't know, it landed in our laps, even though it's been here all along. I was just wondering just to sort of balance the tenor of some of the questions that have gone on. Do you know of any other communities, whether they're in Massachusetts or other places that folks might look at who've done exactly what we're describing with the Superfund site and gone on to positive use as a municipality?
Yes, I think there are many examples, and I think there's a section in the report which kind of lays out those. I think Carl Seidman did a lot of research on that. I don't know if he's on the call. I can't give you specific information offhand, but the more we research, the more we find that there are municipalities that have created, at a minimum, have created park space, have created recreational space. Some have created housing space. A lot have created office space. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a very big set of precedents for creating open recreational space, whether it's trails or fields, and office space.
And while none of those examples are exactly like what we're proposing, because every site is unique, this is the Superfund site, as Paul pointed out, not a brownfield site, but like Devens offers an example. And Devens, one of the interesting things about the Devens redevelopment is they actually had a sustainability overlay district. So there are lots of examples of those examples that we might want to follow, but not necessarily all of it to the letter. So there are, different bits and pieces that you can pick from the menu of redevelopment options.
Right. I was just bringing it up in the sense of to allow people to have some confidence that this is not a first, and that there have been very successful examples in many places, none of which, as you pointed out, Gary, exactly like the Starmet property, but if if your fear is X, some of them might have been much worse and have come to no negative conclusions. So, I just think that we, rather than assuming words like liability, fear words, I think we want to just look at all of the opportunities that lie in front of us and how we, and as you've said, we as a select board need to spend time with town council. And then we as a select board need to think about how best to involve the community as a whole, as you said in the master plan, sort of in this next phase of what can we do with this.
And NXC is actually even better than that because it's not just sort of, 200 random Superfund sites. They actually, Kate McEnany from the planning board and Carl Seidman worked together on this, and they culled through 20 Superfund redevelopments that were most likely to be useful as an example for Concord. Mm-hmm. There's only 20 in there to look at, but they're the 20 that are sort of most interesting and might be useful illustrations.
Matt.
Yeah, I just wanted to also thank the committee. I've been there kind of as the liaison blow by blow, but just to see the summary today, it's quite powerful to just see how all the results of the work. And I think we've got a fairly clear roadmap going forward, and that we should seek to build in to our goals for the next year as we go into the summer, some of the aspects in the report. I also was going to point people to Annex C. I think that those case studies, having been through them, they really give you a sense of the possibility as well as a little bit more comfort that, we're not the first people to take a Superfund site and think about how we might want to use it. There are many, many examples, and, that just can be very beneficial. Then the third thing I wanted to mention is that I think we do look at the differences between municipal uses and commercial uses, and maybe the potential to sell the site or create a ground lease that would earn some revenues. But I just would want to caution on the commercial aspects that if we do get money, the EPA has noted that, since there are folks that are spending significant sums to do the cleanup, they would like to see some of that money as well. Not all of it necessarily, but just that, that is a consideration. If we're instead using it for municipal purposes, of course, it's not like it's a revenue generating thing for us. That would not be as much a consideration.
Yeah, Matt, you bring up an interesting facet. The Department of Justice has a significant lien on the site, and they have told us through EPA that they would forgive that lien if there was some revenue sharing. That is yet to be negotiated, whatever that means. But I think all the parties are bending over backwards to say, Concord, take the site and we'll help you. One other thing in the realm of all things are possible, I've been having conversations with the contractor and saying, could we use part of the site? Could we clean up, are you committed to cleaning up this site, this part first? And I'm thinking specifically of the conservation area and connecting with trails, because I know there's a lot of interest in that part of the site. So, depending on what our preferences are, we could tee that up to them, get that part of the site cleaned up so we could just enjoy the sphagnum bog. And everything's possible.
Linda, could I follow up on that point?
Sure.
So I think to kind of build on Paul's point, and Paul and Gary, it's just sort of a question / correct me if I'm wrong thing, but if the town decided that we just didn't want the liability and didn't want to be a part of and didn't want to own it, my guess is the EPA would divest it to somebody and somebody would develop the site. And then at that point, the town does not have the control over as much control over the program. Is that accurate?
I think that's perfectly accurate. I think we'd be at the mercy is too strong a term of the owner for access and everything else. And we would control it through zoning. That's about it. Exactly.
We would still have, the same planning process. NRC would have to sign off on whatever they would want to do on the wetlands. Planning board would still have to, it's a zoned industrial district. So it would, be subject to industrial zoning. But But outside of that, it would be like any other private developer that had agreed to maintain the institutional controls in place.
So one of the things,
Isn't it limited business district too?
I don't know.
Yeah, but then also I think while it's a slightly different situation, it was really interesting contrast to see what was happening on the Acton side with the Grace site, where there is an owner that's a private owner. And basically in their public meeting, they spent the time just telling the public what they're going to do. And so it felt a lot different than this process.
yeah, I think the point if I may, just for a moment, the point I was building to is having been a part, even though you're right, a Superfund site is not a brownfield site, there are some lessons that can be learned in terms of adaptive reuse of certain sites. And I think that, I think that the site would definitely be developed by somebody in the future. And I think that that's one of the reasons why I think the EPA and the federal government want the town to kind of take ownership first and then figure out where to go from there in terms of the development. And because then, even if we said we're going to dispose of a certain parcel for $1 because we want a certain thing built that the town, that fulfills the town's interest, that would be an option the town could do that. That's happened quite a bit where, whether it's affordable housing or, a specific type of business opportunity that's needed in the community that otherwise wouldn't, make it on a private sector deal, something like that. And the other part, Terry, to your point is, when people do due diligence before acquiring or developing a site, they do what's called they call it 21E. That's the statutory reference, but it's a phase 1 environmental study. Of course, they would find in a phase 1 that there's all this documentation that goes along with this site. And then they would dig into that documentation and find out the depths of clean fill and the areas that are demarked for no dig and everything else. And so it would be regulated that way. Now, that's not to say that something couldn't go bad. Something can always go bad, but there are going to be many. Well, first of all, there's going to be, I think, physical barriers and layers that would, I think, regulate some of this. But then I think there's also going to be many regulatory layers that people would have to get through before they can even put a shovel in the dirt out there. And so just like I said, experientially, I think there are a lot of complications here, but I think as Paul and Gary and Matt noted, other places have sorted through the similar complications to get to a positive end result. And I have every confidence we can do that here.
Yeah, the report outlines some options such as like a long-term ground lease or, the outright sale or lots of other choices, public-private partnerships that we could negotiate. So it's very helpful to see those options in the report.
Right. And one of the other options that Paul just brought up, I'm really intrigued with is maybe to develop Area C first and get people over there, get people, as Jane put it, get rid of the mystery and look at the beauty of it. And then I think it will help with the whole public relations campaign if everybody is, allowed to walk in that section of it. And I'm also interested, Paul and Gary, in whether you prefer the select board to recharge your committee or, change it a little and recharge it, or whether you recommend that we include the representatives from town boards or town committees.
I think the various options, yours to decide. I think having some core committee and then representatives from all those stakeholder committees would be a good unit. To leave it up to the select board to do that coordination, I think is too heavy a lift. I think delegating that kind of coordination through a committee to kind of chart out the next steps, that would be my preference.
Okay. So
I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other. I would leave it to.
I just wanted one other thing. So I say I'm not on the select board, so I may sound like this, but if I were the select board, I would think, yes, we'd like to own this site 5 or 7 years from now. But to do that, here's all the things we need to do. I think that would then set the planning, almost a planning staging of planning, the timing. So I think you wouldn't want to wait 3 years to get town council engaged in this. So now you may not pull the trigger 5 or 7 years from now, but I would start with that assumption. You don't have to make that leap, but
I think one of the things, at least from my perspective, in terms of engaging town council, I think we wanted to see how the master planning process turned out, and so town council is looking at a plan and giving us feedback on a plan. And I agree with everybody. You guys have done, the committee's done a masterful job. It's really yeoman's work in getting it to this place. But at least from my perspective and from town council's perspective, we wanted to see how this played out and got to an ending point, and then use that as our starting point for how we look at this. And so I don't want to say we haven't been unwilling to do it thus far. I just, like I said, I don't think we're at that spot where it's an efficient plug-in, but I think we're getting pretty close.
hmm.
I think, Matt already commented that, we would want to build in some aspects of this and the select board goals going forward. But even before that happened, the size and scope of this project probably would point to something we've done in the past in terms of actually having a workshop format with a dedicated entire Saturday or whatever it might be for the select board and some key consultants to that process to help us think through in more detail some of the next steps that need to happen and how they would happen. I'm just throwing out some kind of direction here in a general way. If I may go back to I too have had the benefit of at least 2 different site walks, and as well as being over there at 229 with DeMaximus to hear some of their reports in terms of the work that they're doing. One question I have is that for over a year and a half now, we've been talking about the environmental impact study that would inform what might happen to A2 in particular in terms of the landfill. Could someone just shed some light on why it's taken, what the timeline is on that, and why maybe it's longer than I had anticipated it would be? Let me put
The environmental impact study is done. They actually did, show as part of their work, what would be the net impact of importing fill versus, taking on site fill. But they kind of, after they had completed that, they basically decided they didn't need the results of that because they identified an alternative source of fill. And so they kind of set aside the environmental impact assessment and said, well, if we can obtain fill directly from 1440 Main Street, if Symes is successful with ZBA and develops their housing development there, then they wouldn't need to touch A2 right now. So they're just going to leave A2 as it is and pursue this alternative source to fill.
That's helpful. That wasn't captured necessarily in the report. I think something to the contrary was maybe perhaps referenced, or at least an earlier stage in the process. So that's helpful. So the committee has actually seen that and looked at that.
And the committee feels comfortable that, up to half of A2 could be used for fill if that falls through and, the 1440 Main Street doesn't. We did come to a decision on A2, but the recommendation is kind of moot because at this point, we don't need to make a decision right away because there may be an alternative source of fill. If that falls through and we need to, then the committee has already said, yeah, we're comfortable using some portion of A2 for fill. If it's needed, and it is, a clean source of fill that's on site that would, reduce greenhouse gas emissions of transport, but it may not be needed.
Okay, thank you. So, I'm sorry to get into that level of question, but it just was something that I noticed was in the report. All right, any other questions from the select board members or comments? I think we would be open to some brief comments from the public right now, given we've got this kind of expertise in front of us. Anyone who would like to make a comment or ask a question at this point?
while we're waiting for public questions, I would just like to give credit to, I mean, I know Paul and I are the public face here, but, you know, Andrew Boardman, Jim Burns, Pam Rockwell, and Carl Seidman, as I mentioned, are the other committee members and really had an equal role in developing all of this. So it's not just Paul and I. And I want to mention and call out your former colleague, Steve Ng, was a member of our committee and contributed heavily for the first year of our process. So Steve gets some kudos and helped particularly with the inception of option 2.
Thank you for the references to the specific people. That's helpful. Thank you. So I think at this point,
Linda, it's Carlin.
yes, okay, Carlin.
Carlin Reed, 83 Witsend. I'm very pleased with this report. It looks like it's very detailed. I'd recommend, if nothing else, that we consider enlarging the legal review budget to allow for an early start on the liabilities issue and the legal review that will be necessary for this project. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlin. Okay. I see Diane's hand up. Diane.
Thanks, Linda. Diane Proctor, 57 Sudbury Road. I wonder what the process is going forward as to how we determine how this is going to be developed, who's going to be making the decisions. I would just like to hear a kind of clarity on that. Perhaps it's been made clear, but it was not made clear to me. Thank you.
We may not have that clarity to give you today, Diane, but it's a good question. I referenced that, you know, one possibility is that the select board would convene some kind of workshop with some appropriate consultants to help us think through the many aspects of in terms of the next steps that needed to be made and who needs to be engaged. What are the financial implications of that? What are the land use and capital planning implications of that as we look at the comprehensive land use and capital planning and then many more aspects that have already been referenced in the report or referenced here today briefly. So I think that's the best clarity I can give you at the moment. I think it's something the select board's going to have to talk further about.
Good. I'm just so happy to hear the select board will be in control of it and talk about it. Fantastic. Thanks, Linda.
Yeah, thanks, Diane.
Linda, I think that's a really excellent suggestion that we have a one-day workshop on this.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments from the public right now? If not, I again want to thank everybody on the 2229 committee that continues to work on the environmental aspects of this site, as well as the enormous work that's been done in addition by all of you on the NMI Reuse Committee.
Yes, Pam Rockwell has been trying to raise her hand.
Okay, and since I just was referencing her and her committee, Pam?
Pam Rockwell, 1810 Main Street. So I wanted to talk about your question about A2 again. The committee looked at A2 and really felt like there were a lot of people who felt it would be nice to have a buffer along the street of trees. And so that's why we were looking at the back area of that for fill. But I want to point out that there are some people who are very interested in putting affordable housing on that site. That's a part of the area that has never been developed. There was never any contamination there. It is pristine and untouched. And it is right along Main Street there, along Route 62. If there were a great outpouring of people who really wanted to put affordable housing there soon, we could ask the contractor to level that site to use so that it could be used for that purpose as part of using fill for the cleanup. They have not started actually collecting fill from their alternate site to store on their site to wait to fill. So that is something that if there were a great outpouring from a particular community that did not want a tree buffer, but instead wanted to develop that A2 site. And we did notice, for instance, when Devens was redeveloped, that people were very comfortable putting housing on parts of Devens where there hadn't been contamination. So they weren't worried about the unexploded ordnance in Devens because they were on an area that had been undeveloped before, or hadn't had a problem with that. And this is one of those areas. Areas A2 and A4 were never developed, have no contamination on them, and are pristine as far as redeveloping them for something that people might be a little uncomfortable with. So, housing is an ideal opportunity there.
Okay, thank you for that further comment and for your work. All right, so I think I've floated the idea of addressing this at a future workshop because it deserves the attention, and it's going to require a great deal of attention in terms of us thinking through as the select board all the next steps, and we are going to need consultants to help us with that process. So again, thanks to everybody, and I'm going to conclude our discussion today of this report, and we encourage others in the community to read this report. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm moving on next to the parking plan presentation.
So, Linda, I'll just say a few brief remarks before I turn it over to Chief O'Connor and Marcia Rasmussen. The purpose of inviting them here tonight was to kind of just give an overview of our parking system. And as we look towards resuming meter enforcement, just reminding, it's been a few years, and so reminding members of the board and the community why the parking system is the way it is and how it got here.
Okay, thank you. And who's going to be leading this discussion?
I think the chief would like me to. So good afternoon. I'm Marcia Rasmussen, Director of Planning and Land Management, and the unofficial parking management czarina, if you will. I think Jeremy has a revised slide deck to display for this purpose. If he could, or do you want me to? Okay, very good. And the next slide, please. So we know that parking is closely linked to our economic vitality, to our local business health, to tourism, to our commuter train stations, for our pedestrians, our traffic patterns, and development potential in the community. And we've also know that we want to accommodate bicycles and we want to improve our signage and wayfinding. Next slide, please. So when we look at parking, we try to make sure that our parking is convenient for our customers and clients of our businesses. We want to have clear areas for town and private employees so that they know where to park. We want to accommodate our commuter parking and make sure that it's in appropriate locations and protect our residential neighborhoods from spillover. Next slide, please. So the history of parking in Concord is long. Back in the 1950s or 60s, parking meters were already in Concord Center and the Thorough Business District. And in 1992, improvements were made in West Concord in a commuter parking lot expansion. And at that point in time, the MBTA said, we want the town to begin charging the commuters who are parking here $1 a day. Well, that led to some concerns by businesses, particularly on Commonwealth Ave, who were fearful that the commuters wouldn't pay for their parking, but would instead take up spaces on Commonwealth Ave. So implemented parking meters on Commonwealth Ave and Church Street in West Concord. In 2005, parking continued to be part of the conversation, and the Long Range Plan Committee recommended a comprehensive town parking program. The 2010 Master Plan for West Concord and the design guidelines also recommended new approaches to parking, to circulation, and our parking requirements. And in 2011, the Chamber requested consideration from the Board of Selectmen to increase the length of time from 1 hour to 2 hours or 3 hours, because people who came to Concord and parked wanted to be able to go to a restaurant as well as shop in some of the local stores. So finally, in 2012, we did a comprehensive parking management study and then began implementation in 2016 with some follow-up and review back in 2018. Next slide, please. Here are some pictures from the archives of the meters as they were in the 50s and 60s, and collecting the coin from our parking meters, as well as setting the meters and counting the coin. This is all thanks to Chief O'Connor. Next slide, please. And then in 1992, we were just using signage, limiting parking to 1 hour over in West Concord, then made improvements to the commuter parking lot, and then began adding the meters in 1993. One of the things that took place, or the reason why we can't use just signs to denote where people are parked is that the police would, and Chief O'Connor, you can jump in here.
Yeah, sure. And it was just recently for the board, Joe O'Connor, Chief of Police. It was mentioned at a previous meeting that you recently had. Someone said, well, have the police chalk tires as they go along. And I've been a police officer. There was a time when I did chalk tires. But two courts of appeal at the federal level have said that is cannot be done, that it's a government intrusion by chalking tires, personal property of people. So the days of chalking tires have passed, and it's really not an efficient way to enforce parking either.
So can we go to the next slide? So the 2012 inventory counted a number of spaces that we have a huge amount of parking out there, that there's both off-street and on-street spaces, that Concord Center has a higher percentage of land that's dedicated to public parking, more so than West Concord, that all of our meters are the same type. They're similar pricing and similar times of operation now, and that 76 of Concord's off-street spaces are restricted to user groups, specific groups, while 91% of the private spaces in West Concord are restricted. But we have a total of 6,671 spaces, which is just amazing to me. Next slide, please. So then I took out, I looked at the number of meters that we have. In Concord Center and the Thorough Depot, there are 218 meters. Out of a total of 1,191 parking spaces, or on-street parking spaces. And then we also have permit parking for the spaces in front of Crosby's Market, 56 spaces. So only 2% of the private spaces have paid parking. While in West Concord, it's a slightly higher number. For the off-street spaces, there are 184, and those are all the commuter spaces that are under the control of the MBTA, as well as the town of Concord. Out of the 2,094 spaces, or 8.7%. And then there are only 78 meters on Commonwealth Ave and Church Street. Next slide, please. So where are all these spaces? And these were our study areas, just generally. So it incorporated the Keyes Road facility on the left, all the way to the Sudbury Road, commercial areas, and some of our residential neighborhoods where we know that commuters and others were parking. So we captured the Cottage Street parking area and some of the spaces that we have around Monument Square. In West Concord, we extended it up to Winthrop Street area to the north, west to Rideout Playground, where we knew that there were several parking areas, into the neighborhoods of Central Street and Pine Street, because we had heard that there were complaints or some concerns about commuters that were parking in those locations. And then as far as some of the neighborhoods of Baker Ave for West Concord. Next slide, please. And then what we found through the study is that it was in the primary commercial areas where we were seeing any kind of the need for greater turnover or monitoring our spaces because of the use of those spaces, but we were having less use of some of the public parking that was available. So the focus has been to just keep the meters in those locations where they existed, where there was high demand, and provide some sense of control so that we are able to provide convenient and available parking for customers and for clients. Next slide. So the fees that are collected from the meters and the enforcement actions that need to be taken go into a parking fund. And so some of the things that we have used the parking fund, these are the major expenditures, had to do with our parking meter officer, which was discontinued in fiscal year 20. We have interfund transfers to cover some of the expenses of the general fund. So the counting of the coin, the unwrapping of dollar bills and so forth, that we discontinued in FY21. But it's street line marking, the pavement markings that help people know where to park or where not to park along the streets. It is very important, especially along Main Street in front of Concord Academy. I know that we were able to improve the parking situation along Main Street with those additional parking spaces, as well as prevent people from parking too close to driveways that would cause problem for the owners or the users of those driveways. And then our traffic control devices, we require electricity, so this fund helps take care of that bill that comes for our streetlights and for our crossing beacons. And then the parking meter repairs, which is a little bit higher than we anticipated, but that's primarily due to the shade and the lack of wireless communications that we have in Concord Center. So that concludes my presentation. So I'll open it up for any questions that the board may have.
So, Marcia, from time to time, Police Chief O'Connor, from time to time, we have received comments prior to COVID. I guess I'll specify that from both some limited business owners as well as some members from the public about the meters. Was that as it appeared at the time, that it was limited to just a few concerns about having the meters in force?
So I guess I'll take that question. Parking and parking meters is not a popular subject with people, some of the interactions, that probably the toughest job on the police department is enforcing meters, because people get passionate about where they're parking. I think there's a real mix when you really talk to people one-on-one, and then sometimes when people get into groups and start discussing it. My experience is you look at those numbers of spaces that there are and take a look at the number of complaints that you hear. The ratio is it's really low. Some of the businesses really depend on turnover of spots, and if you see where the study results came out and where the meters are, that's really the goal of those meters is not revenue. Revenue is certainly something that assists us, but it's to turn those spots over for the businesses that need that constant turnover. And from time to time may hear something from someone, but it's really some of the stories that I hear are the same stories that I heard about 7 years ago when I came from the same people. I just don't hear a number of that many complaints from people, and there are people that do want the meters back on.
That's helpful. And that was part of the reason for my question, was to get a sense of the proportion.
May I add to that? When our initial recommendations included extending parking paid parking to our parking lots. And it was a result of the concerns that were raised by both the business owners and the workers in those Concord Center and in West Concord that we made the decision. Actually, it was the parking management team making a recommendation to you that recommended that we not extend paid parking to our parking lots and have them better utilized and even to increase the hours for some of those spaces so that we have 3-hour parking in certain locations and all-day parking for our workers. I mean, parking is needed by a wide variety of groups. It's not just customers and visitors, but our business owners, their workers. We have commuters in both the Thoreau Depot area and West Concord, and we have students in Concord Center. So all of these different people have different needs for the length of parking and the type of parking that is available. And so in addition to providing parking, for a wide range of options, we also need to improve the safety aspects, the desirability. So making sure our sidewalks are clear, are landscaped, have good lighting at night, in the evening, especially in the winter, to make sure that all of these things contribute to making people feel safe in using parking spaces that might be a little more remote, but then might be free all day.
That's helpful. It's obviously a lot of thought has gone into the tiered approach and extending, different hours, as you said, and then having both free parking available in the public lots to increase utilization. And clearly it is being utilized. So that's good. All right. Any other comments or questions from select board members? We thank you for sort of giving us the history on this and bringing us up to date.
Yeah.
Matt? Yeah.
So, back in 2016, I belonged to a wayfinding task force in West Concord, where we talked about, I think, the very important issue of finding the spots that are there. There's quite a lot of parking that's available in West Concord that's kind of behind buildings and other places. And we had developed a whole process, even had designs for signs and everything. But, now it's almost 5 years later, and I still haven't seen any of that come to fruition. And I'm just curious about it, since it of course, it does sometimes take time to roll things out, but 5 years is a very long time.
It is extraordinarily long, and I do apologize for that. We haven't come up with the right logo. That's been an issue depending on which committee you're talking to at different points in time, and that's been part of the problem. And when we were working last year prior to COVID, we actually had Billy Crosby working with Beth Williams and myself to try to identify locations where we could have those that identifying materials and how to direct people to those parking spaces. And that got put on hold because of the pandemic. So, but we're working toward that, and recently received a grant that to look at those kinds of issues, and I think have refocused with the West Concord Junction Cultural District and the West Concord Advisory Committee also looking at these issues. So I think that there will be some movement, at least in West Concord. Concord Center is a little more challenging because we have some Historic Districts Commission issues with regard to branding Concord Center and how to make that get that information out. And that has not moved very successfully yet.
I guess these days that there may be other options that aren't physical, that it seems like people are always using apps, Parking Buddy or whatever it is. And I just don't know to what degree we might be able to avail ourselves of that, or at least inform those kinds of vendors that, hey, here's all of the authorized parking spots, so that at least people can just leverage that technology.
Technology takes money, takes wireless communication, and we do not have wireless very robust in Concord Center.
I just know that, as I've try to park in like Boston or someplace. There are certainly lots of options like that.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Terry? Yeah.
Well, thank you, Chief O'Connor and Marcia, for giving us the opportunity to discuss this. Nice presentation. And I really like the goals that you put in the beginning. And the first goal is to provide convenient parking for customers, which I think really ties in with economic vitality, which is a big issue for the select board. And I'm just going to say something really frankly, from my perspective, I feel that the meters are very unfriendly toward customers. It's almost like saying to a customer, we're going to charge you just to walk down our streets and come into our shops. And it's just really not a welcoming, it's not the welcoming banner that we want to put out there. And that is my main objection to the parking meters. I know in the city of Quincy, when they took away the meters, sales in those shops went up 20%. It was amazing. No one expected that. And we all know that this is not a program to raise revenue. That's not what it's about. And the revenue that's coming in isn't being used much beyond paying for the parking program itself. It's even causing a deficit with the COVID times. So the only really good reasons that I've ever heard for having these meters are, like the chief said, the employees or the commuters might take up the spaces all day, and then the businesses won't have that turnover. So I would really like to suggest that this issue go for a serious discussion before the Economic Vitality Committee. Perhaps it's time to rethink it. We really want to encourage customers and vitality and tourists, and we don't want to discourage them. It's not that it's so expensive. It's just that if you have to find the quarters or you don't have good cell reception or whatever, you're discouraged. And we really want to be more friendly than that. So I hope that you'll consider this. Thanks.
Okay, Jane.
Thanks. And I am, this is, I feel like we've, in the 6 years I've been on the select board, this issue has been revisited and revisited because we don't have all the answers. And certainly what it seems that's missing is that if we're talking about a modern parking system where, the obvious piece is technology based, which allows, as Matt said, you to find both where the spots are and to pay for them so that it doesn't, to Terry's point, interrupt a walk or a stroll or a whatever, potentially. And so as Marcia said, we get stymied at different places. We can take it thus far, and then something happens and there's no ability to go further. I think the other challenge I want to just throw out in front of us in terms of why another of the benefits of a parking plan and potentially a parking meter plan or a timing plan is that it also tells us where, I'll take West Concord, for example. There's a lot of hidden parking in West Concord, but if that started to get actively used, there'd be a lot of cars popping in and out of spaces that we need to plan that would be happening. Just like the parking spaces behind Vanderhoof's in Concord Center are known by some, not by all, and coming in and out it'll impact how the traffic patterns move through town. I'm not saying these are reasons not to go ahead. I'm just saying that the whole umbrella of discussion needs to be thought through, and I feel like we've done it. multiple times with multiple goals, but that Concord itself is never committed to a path. So I think it's, I feel like we've taken a lot of Marcia's time, a lot of Chief O'Connor's time, a lot of Stephen's time and the former town managers. I mean, we put a lot of energy into this. And then we've even taken stabs at things that didn't end up being as productive as we'd hoped. So I'm a little, and given that I'm somewhat of a lame duck right now, it's hard for me to imagine what the next steps are going to be and where the commitment is to coming up with a definitive plan, and one that can fit both sides of Concord.
Right. Well, Jane, do you think it should maybe be discussed at the Economic Vitality Committee?
I think there are a lot of places to discuss it. I'm not going to prejudge that. And I'm not, clearly the Economic Vitality Committee is one of the voices that should be heard. But, I suspect Chief O'Connor and Marcia and others have, deep experience in this space.
So the only thing I would add, just to to the conversation is the town has made a significant investment in the parking meter program, and that in that 2016. When this was all adopted in the new meters, and the new meters were put in place. The pictures that you saw of Dominic Pagano, who served the department for 20 years from the 50s to the 60s, those types of meters were the types of meters that were replaced, and that was because of demand from the citizens that asked for technology upgrades. Pay by phone. Credit card, and at the time the manager wanted to get as many options into those meters as possible. Unfortunately, we learned how bad our cells problem was, but we worked out with replacing different meters and so forth, and the vast majority are performing. So I just want you to consider that, and just going back when I talk about my time being on the beat walking is quite often when there aren't meters. You will have people who will attempt to take advantage, and at that time when I was doing that kind of work, businesses did not like that, and I do even in these awful times of the pandemic, on weekends we're pretty busy in our commercial areas and in our business districts, and I think that's a great thing, and ultimately policy is your decision to decide, but I think meters do work, and there was quite an extensive study that is right on the website for you to take a look at if you want to refresh on that.
Can I just,
Stephen, yeah.
Yeah, so I think, I hear, Terry, I hear what you're saying, and I think, we certainly went through that. We did turn the meter, we did suspend enforcement during the pandemic as a way to support businesses because we wanted to remove a disincentive to going downtown. But I think that was a unique circumstance because there was, even with that, especially last spring and then last late fall, you could really see a noticeable drop off in utilization spaces. I think what I just want to kind of say, well, first of all, I think it was Yogi Berra who said nobody goes downtown anymore. There's all the parking spots are full or something like that. There's a bit of that sort of cognitive dissonance of, parking meters being a disincentive to go downtown and the idea that there's not enough parking downtown. When you think about those two things, if both of those things really probably can't be true at the same time. And so, the thing I think about Marcia's presentation that has stuck with me, I looked at the slides before when she and I talked about this. It is a system. It's not just a set of meters. The parking plans that Marcia just laid out is a system for 3 separate districts that has unique features, and each district has its own unique features, and there are some that are similar. But that system includes meters. It includes non-metered spaces. With some time, restrictions. It also includes free and open spaces. It includes parking areas. And so it's, and I think as Marsha laid out, the metered spaces are by far the minority of parking spots. It's just in those critical zones where turnover is key. And so, for example, Terry, if you park on Monument Square, you don't need to feed a meter, and you can, you're a stone's throw from the business district. And so I just want to bear in mind that, and I think I've talked to the EDC tons about parking, but I just want to kind of leave on the note that, or leave for the purpose of this agenda item on the note that, just to remind you, it's a system that has many facets and components driven by many variables related to the conditions in the field at the curbside. And it's obviously the product of 70 years, a system 70 years in the making. So I just don't want to, it has gotten a lot of thought and discussion over the years. And so I don't want to look like we're changing tack just, that quickly, because it's decades in the making. And I think we need to be pretty thoughtful about undoing that.
Right. So just as a follow-up to that, it definitely has a long history and people have put a lot of energy into it. What happens on Sundays or during the Christmas season when we're not enforcing the meters? Not in the pandemic year, in a regular year. Are we having a big problem Christmas time or Sundays? And why are we not enforcing the meters then? It doesn't really make sense to me that you would enforce them on one day and not another day.
Well, traditionally in New England, Sundays generally don't enforce meters and holidays.
Are we having a bigger problem on Sundays than the rest of the week?
I don't collect that data, but I don't think we get the same volume either. Marsha might have that data from the studies.
I don't think we even looked at Sundays because there is no demand. There's very little demand for parking on Sundays. We don't charge for holidays either. So specific holidays, it's also free.
But the stores, the tradition on Sunday, I mean, we had the blue laws for many, many, many years.
Right.
But now shops and restaurants are open on Sundays. There's lots of tourists here. Lots of residents are shopping on Sundays. The times are different. And I think it's great we don't have to pay the meter on Sunday, but it's data that we could look at to see how it would go for the other days. And the same with the holiday season.
The Chamber of Commerce would traditionally come to the select board to request that there be no charge for parking on weekends during the holiday season in December. So you have considered that and have put that in place, and we've tried to make that the businesses aware of that, so their customers are aware of that, and with that it promotes shopping in Concord Center on the weekends during the holiday season. So that is your discretion. It's nothing that we do one way or the other. It's something that is a discretion of the select board.
I mean, I think the thing is, it's a psychological benefit. In normal non-COVID times, the idea that the meters are off is a marketing psychological benefit, because theoretically you're competing against, say, a shopping mall that doesn't charge for parking. Although I'll tell you that at a shopping mall at Christmas time, you're walking 3 times further to get from your space to the door than you would just about anywhere in any of the 3 business districts in Concord. And this is not an issue unique to this town. I mean, parking is an issue in every place I've worked, and it's viewed very different ways. So, and that was part of the approach during COVID-19, was that psychological benefit of not having to pay to go downtown for parking. But I think, like I said, in normal times, the system that Concord has is very well designed and makes a lot of sense for the local economy that you have.
Marsha, may I ask, in terms of when the renewed efforts on signage might occur?
They're underway.
Okay.
So we've been meeting with, I've been meeting with the West Concord Junction Cultural District and with Beth Williams in the tourism office to look at how we can better convey the parking spaces that are available, to improve our maps that are available, to get information up online where parking is located. It's our we need an outside consultant, I think, to help us create a really good map. Right now, the West Concord Junction Cultural District is working with a person who is going to be helping us with some mapping, and maybe we'll be able to take some ideas from that and do a better job and be able to deliver that online, as well as having a printable map available.
Okay, thank you. All right. Any other comments or questions from the select board?
Yeah, I just note that, I mean, a lot of the Sunday and Saturday, parking, there's not significant competition from the commuter rail or from the schools, right? I mean, Concord Academy and other places. I think that those are the sources of most of the conflict that we see. I think and then employees, there are a significant number of employees who work, within those business districts who might occasionally want to take a spot for the whole day. And so those are the things that actually hurt businesses. I do agree that it's a bummer to pay parking, and I would love to find a better alternative. But I also think that we may be lulled into complacency here by the recent COVID experience, and just that very quickly I expect that we're going to find ourselves in the same sort of circumstances as before, and that those who might take advantage of this system could really impede business rather than help business. And again, I wish we had better empirical data, and I wish we also had better alternatives, especially considering that we really are not seeking to raise revenue through this channel. I mean, I'd rather see, like, you click the meter. I love the 12 minutes free. I wish it was 2 hours free, frankly, but not just the feed the meter every 2 hours. If you're an employee, you go on your quick break and you end up, taking the spot of the whole day. We want to avoid those kinds of situations. So I don't know how to, balance enforcement with convenience, but it seems like people aren't happy. People are never happy with this. When the Mass Pike changed its tolls to where you just drove through and you didn't have to stop, suddenly tolls were not a barrier anymore, and I'd love to see something like that. You just park and suddenly you're billed. And if you don't leave in time, suddenly you're billed. You get a ticket. That's the method we want to get to somehow.
If it isn't this conversation, it's another conversation where we're talking about the wonderful attributes of employing technology, but getting us there is the real challenge in terms of cost and design and all kinds of things. And it's not as though we are not mindful of it. And we need to keep working on this, clearly. All right. I think we are where we are right now on this topic. The reason I asked you, Marcia, about the work that's in progress right now in the signage, because the implementation of that, along with the other aspects of what's being looked at that you commented on, we could see another significant difference. And then we would want another set of data in terms of the changes that are happening. So it's hard to know at what point we intervene here with yet another scheme.
I think in terms of wayfinding, Linda, I would say that that's something Marcia and I did talk about with Beth Williams, a long time ago, and that is something that I think we could benefit from, renewed effort on. In terms of our parking system, we'll look at that, but I just think it was fairly recently analyzed, and I think we would have to look at, did COVID really change those patterns? And if they didn't, I don't know how much more analysis would give us. I would bet. Well, let me say it this way. Let me say it differently. I think the thing to do is to find out if there's a different way of looking at it than we have looked at it in the past. If we look at it the same way, I'm confident. I've been doing this for 20 years. We're going to get the same result. Of a balanced program with meters and other different types of parking, because it makes sense, because those are the tools that are in the toolbox that exist today for parking systems. But I think that there's a conversation to be had about, are retail and shopping patterns changing enough where a different way of looking at it, is called for. And I think that's a conversation we definitely should be having.
Okay. I think we'll leave it there, and it's, I think, on your agenda at this point to take the next step. All right. Thank you, Chief O'Connor and Marcia Rasmussen, for your presentations today and for your continued work on this, because this will not be the last time, I'm sure, that we have to revisit this, unfortunately, if history remains true.
You're welcome.
You're welcome, yeah.
Thank you. All right. I'm going to move on quickly to committee nominations, of which there are none, and committee appointments.
You're on mute, Jane.
Sorry. Move to appoint Tourism Director Beth Williams, Senior Planner Heather Gill, and Historical Commission Representative Nancy Nelson to the Battle Road Scenic Byway Committee for terms to expire on April 30th, 2023. Mark Giddings of 474 Barrett's Mill Road. I noticed that we didn't give Nancy Nelson's address. Do we need to do that for her since she's a resident?
Yes.
Okay, so that would be, I don't have it in front of me.
It's Lowell Road.
Okay, does anybody know what number on Lowell?
We can.
Okay. Nancy Nelson of Lowell Road to the Battle Road Scenic Byway Committee for terms to expire on April 30th, 2023.
How about 1695 Lowell Road?
Okay, amended, 1695 Lowell Road.
Ooh, okay, just want to double check. Yeah, okay.
Okay, Mark Giddings of 474 Barrett's Mill Road as the Hanscom Field Advisory Commission representative for a term to expire on April 30th, 2024.
Thank you. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Okay. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
Ms. Ackerman.
Aye.
Ms. Escobedo.
Aye.
Myself, Jane Hotchkiss, aye.
It's unanimous and the chair so declares. Stephen, do we have a time certain with Christina?
No, I'm keeping her informed of our progress. I just let her know it should be about 10 more minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. If we could have moved to committee liaison reports and make them as succinct and brief as possible. Essential, however, information.
Sure, this is Matt. I'll jump in since Susan isn't here.
Thank you.
So the middle school building committee spent time going through both the community feedback and the different options for gymnasium and auditorium space, among other things, as well as discussing in depth the different project build options. And the committee will meet again this Thursday and expects to vote on those matters. Then the Zoning Board of Appeals had a 3.5-hour marathon meeting where there were 3 significant applications discussed, one from the umbrella. And while they were just asking about a tent, there was quite a bit of feedback from the neighborhood about just issues with the prior development work. They were, light, noise, those kinds of things that were referred to the building commissioner, and also the hours that were requested were restricted for the tent in the near term until I think it can be demonstrated that, everything's going to be okay with that operation. The 1442 Main Street earth removal permit was initially discussed and has been continued for until June in light of the other litigation that's taking place at the moment. And then the Concord Country Club reviewed again some of the unauthorized work that had been done on this pond and the different kinds of mitigation procedures that they could pursue, and also just how to move forward with a project. So that again, there was significant discussion and suggestions about how perhaps working with the neighbors, as well as looking at all more detailed plans, 3D renderings and so forth. There could be maybe a movement forward on that. So then the Housing Authority did vote to approve the forwarding of a contract for Martin Corona to the DHCD in order to have him become the new executive director of the Housing Authority, and that process will take some time. And there was also a housing roundtable in which the League of Women Voters and also others participated in discussing possible affordable housing sites and housing production that will feed into the update of the housing production plan in this coming year.
Thank you, Matt. Who would like to go next? Terry?
Okay, I had 4 meetings to report on briefly. West Concord Junction Cultural District, they are working on that logo and a consultant for the wayfaring. May 19th through 22nd, there will be an event in West Concord led by the businesses. They're going to spread it out over 4 days so shoppers can venture into stores and spread out. There'll also be a scavenger hunt, live music, arts and crafts, and art walk, and the farm mural will be going up on the side of Saltbox Kitchen. So we hope for good weather and lots of customers on May 19th through 22nd. On the 8th, I attended, covering for Jane, a multi-town gas leaks meeting. This is run jointly by the MAPC and Mothers Out Front. And again, they were talking about how towns are putting the gas leaks on their town websites and what to do if you suspect a gas leak, the map of known leaks in town that's been developed by an organization called HEAT. And for example, Concord has 163 unrepaired leaks and 62 repaired leaks as of 2019. So hopefully we can work with the GIS people in Concord and the CPW, and we can get some of this on our website. It would be really great. I also attended the Transportation Advisory Committee meeting, really good meeting about Old Marlborough Road. And in particular, Phil Posner had some comments that may end up coming to the select board. Stephen is going to be working with town council because as you recall, we voted as a select board to have a standard 25-mile-an-hour speed limit all throughout town. And when you enter Concord from one of the other towns, you see a sign saying that. However, on Old Marlborough Road and some of the other arterials, there's all kinds of speed changes, 7 or 10 speed changes in 1 or 2 miles, which is really unenforceable and undoable. So we're trying to figure out which supersedes which. The select board vote or the DOT signs that were put up, some of them decades ago, based on those zone studies. So we'll be hearing more about this. And then finally, you'll remember that we signed a proclamation for the Days of Remembrance for the victims of the Holocaust. And last night, Stephen was there. They had a beautiful ceremony on Zoom. And the speaker was Johanna Glazer, a teacher at CCHS. She was very provocative, challenging all of us to look at ourselves and our behavior. What are we doing to stand up against injustice and discrimination? So that is the end of my liaison report.
Thank you, Terry. Jane.
Luckily, Terry reported on the Transportation Advisory Committee, so I don't have to. The only thing I would add to her report was that the Route 2 culvert installation was discussed, which the town manager discussed earlier. And again, we also touched base on the Junction Park issues and follow up there. And then I attended a Natural Resources Commission meeting, which was lengthy and not surprising because it's that time of year that all of the continuances are coming. There was a discussion, further notice of intent discussion by Westchester Company on the Lot 2A Cuca Road. And there was a recognition that of access that that the new road would have to be the recognized point of access, not the existing. And further, just skipping through other notices, Middlesex School continues to discuss. They're seeking approval to improve existing playing fields with the conversion of infields to artificial turf. And that conversation continues and has been continued to the 21st. Really, it is a heartfelt community discussion about the improvements in different turf designs and the impact of the use of artificial turf on the environment as a whole, especially as we go into resilience in climate change. Then we also then the town was in front with their new application for White Pond, which was the beginning of this process in front of the NRC. Again, to improve vehicular access and boat ramp, construct the ADA compliant picnic areas and walkways, and to install a new stormwater management system within the 100-foot buffer zone. This is ongoing. And the final point of interest here was probably the notice of intent at 299 Estabrook Road, seeking to for the approval to conduct invasive species removal and management in the bordering land subject to flooding and bordering vegetated wetland in the 200-foot riverfront area of Dakins Brook. And while I think there was a lot of appreciation for the removal of invasive species, it's always more complicated at the outset of a notice of intent than perhaps anybody anticipated. So with that, I will simply skip the rest and move to you, Linda.
Okay, thank you. Some of what I was going to report on has already been reported, but let me just, in Susan's absence, let me just say that one of the main agenda items for the Economic Development Committee was to begin their work on an action plan to define barriers and how for businesses to come to Concord, and they're just starting that process, but made good progress. And then we'll define tasks that come out of that. So that concludes the liaison reports. Public comment. Very quickly, I would consider public comment. Okay, Dean.
Okay. Hi, Dean Banfield, 73 Walden Terrace. I thought the parking discussion was really quite scintillating, but there was something significantly missing since we're talking about a system and a full scheme. There was no discussion of how we revitalized the business district by adding a few places for buses to park, which would allow people to come to the business district in large numbers and get out of a bus. So that needs to be something that gets on the radar. The other piece of the parking puzzle, which has been brought to my attention, at least during COVID times, is that there's an enormous amount of pressure on parking for our conservation lands. And so that needs to be a piece of this as well. There was a good study done, the Estabrook Access study, and that was by and large shelved. There were numerous recommendations made in there, specifically about Punkatassett access, et cetera. And those were followed up briefly, but have been tabled. And I think that should be re-looked at because parking on Monument there is extremely dangerous and is not consistent with a complete streets program. So those are my comments on parking. So thank you.
Thank you for reminding us of those topics. Okay. Okay,
Hello? Brooks
yes.
Reed, I'd like to make
Brooks Reed, yeah.
My name is Susanna K. Reed, 366 Estabrook Road. I appreciate Mr. Banfield's comments on revisiting the town-owned conservation land at Punkatassett. It's interesting the town owns quite a lot of other conservation land as well, and I suggest that parking and access also be considered. The small amount of town-owned land, which is only about 100 acres, can be easily overburdened, and the NRC has made that point. And I think the rest of the town needs to carry some burden of the conservation access as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and Brooks Reed. Okay, that was that comment. Any other public comment? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to close that and ask for motion to adjourn to
I think we could acknowledge the other correspondence that we received. It was in the packet, though.
In the packet, yes, thank you. I'm going to ask for a motion to adjourn to executive session, not to return to open session to discuss strategy with respect to ongoing litigation regarding the Symes Development and Permitting LLC versus Town of Concord et al., as an open meeting may have a detrimental effect on the litigating position of the town.
I move to adjourn to executive session, not to return to open session to discuss strategy with respect to ongoing litigation regarding Symes Development and Permitting LLC versus the Town of Concord et al. As an open meeting may have a detrimental effect on the litigating position of Concord as declared by the chair. Ms. Ackerman?
Second.
A second, thank you. Ms. Ackerman?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Ms. Escobedo?
Aye.
Myself, Ms. Hotchkiss, aye.
That's unanimous and the chair so declares. So good night, everyone, and thank you for your participation today. Select board members, please